hover door thuds closed as I return to the driver's seat, a place which seems to feel more at home with each passing second. The sound of the rain endlessly engulfs my vehicle with its constant cascade, and the muffled sounds of the city outside are all I have to keep me company while I wait for the next call from control, the next story, the next delivery. Around me, the blackness of an ever-darkened sky is pierced only by endless neon lights scattered amongst monoliths of steel and concrete that stretch 100 miles down and 1,000 up, and the murky flames emerging intermittently from outlets and vents peppered throughout the skyline. As I sit amongst both the wonder and the desolation of it all, simultaneously enraptured and disgusted, I start to wonder if those in the lower levels have ever seen the sun. It's my first night in Nivalis, and it feels like there is much I have yet to learn about its people, its history, and its future. The call snaps me from my daydream. It's control. I have a delivery. Break's over, I guess. As my hover hums to life and I check the map for a nav point, the daydream lingers for a moment longer. What secrets does this city hold, and who obfuscates them from view? What will I learn here, and who will I be by the end of the night? The comm crackles again, this time with a pickup location. It's HQ. I guess I'm headed to Cloudpunk. Cyberpunk is a big subgenre for me. While it's seen a resurgence in popularity in recent years, with cult hits like Blade Runner 2049 and of course the most obvious champion of the genre, the live-action Super Mario Bros. Movie, it has enjoyed a substantial existence as a subgenre of science fiction since the early 1980s. Bred out of the post-war fear of both technology and classism, there are generally three pieces of fiction associated with the birth of cyberpunk. The first, Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is seen more as a proto-cyberpunk novel, which addresses many of the subgenre's common themes and begins to develop many of its concepts. However, it wouldn't be until the movie adaptation, Ridley Scott's 1982 science fiction masterpiece, Blade Runner, that these themes would be used to solidify both the subgenre itself and its many elements, both philosophical and aesthetic. Just 2 years later, in 1984, author William Gibson would further solidify the high-tech, low-life, dystopian, megacity-filled, overpopulated, class-driven concepts with his seminal novel, Neuromancer, a book that would share many similarities thematically to Blade Runner by pure coincidence, a fact that would even cause Gibson to reportedly rewrite the first section of his novel 12 times to try and set it apart from Scott's movie. Nevertheless, Gibson's Neuromancer would become a modern classic all on its own, and achieve its deserved status next to Blade Runner as a key inception point for the creation of cyberpunk. In the years since, many films, books, TV shows, comics, and even tabletop games would add to, develop, deconstruct, and even retread this subgenre and its themes, as it continued to grow a cult following and enjoy fleeting popularity in and out of most mainstream popular culture. However, some of the most interesting uses of cyberpunk have come in the medium of video games. While much like all other mediums, it's a subgenre that continues to see fluctuating levels of popularity in the mainstream. The ability to engage with its themes and philosophical ideas is often heightened by the agency allowed to those experiencing the story at hand. With the elephant in the room that is Cyberpunk 2077 recently releasing, and no doubt repopularizing or recontextualizing this subgenre, I thought I would use my little slice of the internet to shine a light on some other games that call Cyberpunk home, and there is no better place to start than the recently released indie title, Cloudpunk. If you've ever seen Blade Runner, you might remember this scene, but maybe you won't. It's not the best scene, it's not Tears in Rain, or the first meeting with Rachel. It's just Deckard in a car, staring at a world both awe-inspiring and depressing as he reflects on his situation, his past, his mistakes, and his existence. For as long as I can remember, this scene has stuck with me. As an introspective and generally overtly reflective person, I often imagine myself doing the same thing in Deckard's position. somehow simultaneously being affected only by the world around him and the world within his mind. If there's one scene that I think reflects how it feels to exist in Cloudpunk's world, it's this one. Developed by a small German developer named Ion Lands, Cloudpunk places the player in the shoes of Rania, a young woman who has recently moved to the megacity of Nivalis from the enigmatic Eastern Peninsula, a rural area some ways east, which was seemingly free from the urban sprawl seen in her new home. Running from an uncertain and initially undefined past, Rania has taken a job with a less than reputable and often less than legal delivery service named Cloudpunk. The game begins as Rania starts her first shift for the titular enterprise and follows her through her first night of work for the firm. Over the course of the 8 to 12 hour journey, the player learns more about Rania, Nivalis, Cloudpunk, the Eastern Peninsula, and the state of society and those that inhabit it in this bleak yet beautiful version of the future. It's here that first commendation should be given to the way Cloudpunk tells its story. Unlike a more traditional narrative, or even a more traditional open world style game, Cloudpunk chooses to convey its story, lore, and character exposition pretty much entirely through dialogue, ambient sounds, and the general atmosphere of Nivalis itself. While this can occasionally lead to a few interactions that lack subtlety...
No, I can't go to a shelter. Nari wouldn't think to look for me there.
Who is Nari?
She is gone, and when she left, she took all my happiness with her.
Writers who use subtext, and they're all cowards.
For the most part, everything is handled with a patience and a level of contemplation and introspection rarely seen in modern games. Of course, such slow, cerebral storytelling is often a feature of Cyberpunk stories, but here it is utilised extremely well, and allows for the execution of concepts way higher than a game of this level of budget and production resources should be able to pull off. For the most part, the game involves speaking to the inhabitants of Nivalis, be they human, android or AI, delivering various packages, people and favours to those who call the megacity home, and making a few decisions about how proceedings may play out. But it is in the quiet moments of reflection in between these tasks that the world, its people, and its philosophical and societal messages and deconstructions are often explored. As an example, there's one mission about halfway through the game where Rania decides she wants to take a short break and have a cup of coffee. Hopping in your hover, you take a leisurely drive to the nearest cafe and order, exchanging pleasantries with both the cafe worker and a flirtatious citizen who's also stopped for a coffee break. Now, there's no real plot delivered in this sequence, no revelation or exposition dump, just reflection and the building of atmosphere as Rania takes a slow walk back to her hover vehicle, listening to advertisements for emotion suppressors or life-changing augments as she navigates through the neon-soaked streets. Maybe she'll see someone you've helped out earlier in the night, or maybe she'll see no one but the endless stream of strangers that line the streets. Interestingly, all of these elements build as the game progresses, and before it's done, you'll know more than you expect about the city of Nivalis, its inhabitants, its infrastructure, its seedy streets, and its even seedier underbelly. While not all story threads pay off, and there is some stilted elements, it's incredible how well this works to tell a quietly enrapturing story. It's certainly not going to be for everyone, and it's best to know going in that it requires some patience. But if you're a fan of slow, cerebral, philosophically and socially charged cyberpunk science fiction, then look no further than this little tale with big ideas. The gameplay is relatively simple. Generally, you'll spend your time travelling between nav points, talking to NPCs and waiting for your next job. However, while this might not sound thrilling, it's actually the perfect ludology to hang a tale like this on. Cloudpunk is a game driven by its atmosphere, its themes and its presentation, not its complex gameplay, and so the light nature of its mechanics feel appropriate. But for me, this all added to the tone. I was happy to exist in Nivalis, to do my day job and to learn more about Rania and the city. Also, as you may have already noticed, I played the entire game in first person. While this feature was not available at launch, it has subsequently been added by the game's developer, and for me at least, it's a transformative change. Inhabiting the city and getting immersed in all its elements was so much easier in first person, whether walking around or sitting in the driver's seat of my hover vehicle. As well as the aforementioned mechanics, there are also a peppering of other systems going on in Cloudpunk, which both add to the immersion and also allow for more agency in your playthrough. Firstly, there's a ton of collectibles, some of which are needed for side quests, some of which build lore, and some of which can be sold for money. Rania is also paid a wage for each delivery, and can also earn money from various other quests and activities. This money can be spent on hover repairs and upgrades, food and drink of your choice, and also upgrading your very own apartment, which can be returned to at any time. Here you can hang out, buy new decorations, eat pizza, admire the incredible view, or even play some video games if you have the funds to afford a console. Meta. When it comes to the so-called main questline, there is enough variety to hold your interest and create a genuine desire to keep going, if only to see where the story goes next. Also, regarding the game's quests, it's worth noting that many of those that have decisions for the player to make have little to no effect on the game's outcome. While there are some that definitely affect how individual character stories play out, it seems that Cloudpunk is a game that enjoys exploring the philosophy of making a decision rather than the ramifications of that decision itself. This leads to one of my few definitive criticisms of Cloudpunk, the lack of consequence for your actions. Often it will present you with a genuinely well thought out tough decision, but all options almost always lead to the same place instantly, and so after a while it feels like these choices matter way less. As an example, early in the game you get a job to deliver a package that is clearly a bomb. You're given a choice of delivering it as told or throwing it away into a secluded location where it can't hurt anyone. Whichever of these you pick, the game is seemingly unaffected beyond a slight change in dialogue after the mission is complete. You would think that such a monumental decision would have consequences, but really there doesn't seem to be many, if any at all, for many of the choices like this that the game presents to you. There are multiple endings to Cloudpunk, but unfortunately these seem to boil down to a binary, multiple choice decision presented to the player at the end of the game, which is a real shame, as while it would have been more difficult for the team to execute, an ending based on the many smaller decisions you had made throughout the game would have felt much more natural. Still, I guess this is a minor criticism, and one of the few I have regarding the game in general, and perhaps it was also intentional. Life in Nivalis often necessitates taking each moment as it comes, and reflecting on the nature of the decisions you have to make, rather than their ramifications. First things first, I would implore you to play this game in first person. The level of immersion between that and the standard camera view is night and day in my opinion, and I immediately felt more part of the game's world when looking through Ranya's eyes. The art style is interesting. It somehow successfully blends blocky pixelated elements with hyper-realistic reflections, lighting and particle effects to create a world that is simultaneously unique and realistic all at once. While I'm unsure if the choice to make many elements of the world, such as its inhabitants and its vehicles, in a blockier art style was a budgetary one, somehow it works well and serves only to make the game even more unique. While I can't lie and say that a photorealistic Nivalis to run around would have been one of the few things that would have made this game even better, it would have somehow robbed it of some intangible quality that I only came to appreciate more as the game progressed. Often I would simply drive around looking for side quests, diners or familiar faces, taking in the game's sights and sounds. Bizarre as it sounds, such endeavours often came close to role-playing, as I sat watching the rain run down my Hobbit's windshield and wondered how to get back to that place that I ate at hours ago. Indeed, as I'm sure you can see from the footage, all of these elements coalesce to form one of the most unique and visually stunning games I've played in a while, and this is almost all because of its art style. While the juxtaposition of its elements can occasionally cause a disconnect, especially when looking at the difference between character models and their dialogue portraits.
Just rip here and... oh. Hey, you.
It nevertheless succeeds at what it sets out to achieve. It's not a technical marvel by any stretch, but some of its buildings and areas are truly breathtaking in their own way and create a tangible world without elements like a ton of buildings you can go into or huge areas to explore. It gives the feeling of a lived-in, massive world, and it does it all using innovation and creativity over cutting-edge technology. However, one thing that is worth noting here is that I was playing on PC, and so while I have heard it runs fine on consoles, I'm unsure exactly how these aesthetics or even how the performance will translate when playing on other formats. As such, while I usually have zero preference on this front, I would recommend playing on PC if you have the means.
If you have the means, I highly recommend picking one up,
As it ran buttery smooth and looked incredible. All of this is further compounded by great sound effects and decent voice acting, with some characters performing better than others. However, the thing that really ties everything together is the excellent soundtrack, which channels Vangelis' original Blade Runner score. Speaking of Vangelis, it is clear that much of what is seen here is inspired by Blade Runner and Neuromancer, and a clear reverence can be felt for those texts in almost all elements of Cloudpunk's DNA. But as I mentioned before, none of it feels derivative, and instead, it feels more like coming home than experiencing an imitation. So, as is often the case with smaller indie titles, there is a little bit of jank present in Cloudpunk, although nowhere near as much as in many other indie and apparently AAA titles nowadays. At a few points, I had nav points remain for a while after they should have disappeared. UI elements vanish for some time until re-entering my hover. The hover's parking cam getting stuck on when driving around, and 1 or 2 lines of dialogue playing twice. However, I cannot stress enough how infrequent and brief many of these issues were, and nothing came close to breaking the game or my immersion. I would say on average, any bug I experienced was only present for a matter of minutes before it fixed itself or stopped occurring. Once again, I've heard this is also the case on other formats. However, having only experienced the game on PC, I would at least advise maybe checking into this to make sure if you're planning on playing on console. I'm certain that the PS4, Xbox One and Switch are more than capable spec-wise of running a game like this, but you just never know with ports. Replay value here is relatively dependent on how you feel about the game's atmosphere and tone. While there are multiple endings, as mentioned earlier, and even multiple decisions to make, the general story flow means that many probably won't return for a second run. And to be honest, I don't really necessarily see that as a bad thing. It took me just over 12 hours to beat Cloudpunk, and I did 100% of the side content and a bunch of other optional collectibles and Steam achievements. And for me, that was the perfect length for a game of this type and price. It doles out story at just the right moments and keeps you hooked till the end. Once the game is beaten, you are able to freely roam around Nivalis to take in the sights and finish anything you may have missed. While I can't pretend that I won't take my hover for a spin on occasion, and maybe come back for a second run at some point, right now I am more than satisfied that it was worth the price of admission. As a lifelong fan of Cyberpunk and the stories told in the subgenre, I can say without hesitation that I loved Cloudpunk. It may have a few quirks, bugs and flaws, and it's far from perfect, but in the end, few of its flaws matter due to its clear reverence and understanding for the subgenre which it inhabits. Through subtle, reflective, slow and cerebral storytelling, it successfully manages to engage with many interesting philosophical and social themes without once succumbing to spoon-feeding or exposition dumps. While it does occasionally lose its subtlety, or fail to really comment on some of that with which it engages, it nonetheless creates an interesting story set against a beautiful backdrop. It won't be for everyone, but for a fan of Cyberpunk who dreamed as much of experiencing the more contemplative moments from the subgenre's history as they did the more action-packed or revelatory ones, it's a no-brainer. Much like Deckard staring out of the window, wondering how and why he and the world arrived at the point at which it finds itself, Cloudpunk is a game for those who long to reflect on the many questions raised by the concept of living in a cyberpunk future. I woke with a start to a loud yet familiar sound. It was the comm. I guess Control had another job for me. The slow, constant patter of the rain had been hypnotic before, pushing me down into my own subconscious until I had fallen into sleep's embrace. The city looked the same, its darkness, its neon, its people. I wondered if they'd always been like this, or if this is how it would always be. I wiped the sleep from my eyes and reminded myself that getting used to a night shift would be just one of many prices I needed to pay for past indiscretions. I checked the nav point, back to HQ. I guess I was on my way again. On my way to redemption. On my way to freedom. I guess I'm headed to Cloudpunk.